Today I'm going to be talking about words and phrases that start with the letter U that are found in the mountains of Appalachia. At least they were at some point. A lot of them have fallen out of fashion and are not used as often today. I'm using for reference the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English, and you can do a search and find it for sale online. It's very expensive because it's out of print. I've had mine for many years. They did make a second edition of the dictionary, and the title of it is the Dictionary of Southern Appalachian English. You can look for that one's way better priced and more easy to find. It is still an expensive book, but nothing compared to the original issue, the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English. So the very first one is ugly as homemade sin, ugly as a mud fence, daubed with chinky pins or tadpoles. An adjective phrase, extremely ugly, very homely. 1940, Hans Hawks Dunn, he told her she was ugly as a mud fence daubed with tadpoles. Throwed that up to her one time when he was mad. So he was mad, he was saying something ugly. Now, I've heard ugly as homemade sin my whole life, but I've never heard the part about ugly as a mud fence. I've heard that one too, ugly as a mud fence, but never the part daubed with chinky pins or tadpoles. I happen to like tadpoles, and I like chinky pins too. People used to tell me all the time when I was a little girl that I had chinky pin eyes. So that one, those are, like I was saying, some of them's fallen out of fashion. I would say the ending of that one has for sure. At least in my area. If not, if you've ever heard that in your area, please leave a comment and tell us about it. The next one, there's actually 3 of them. It's umbrella leaf, and then the next entry is umbrella plant, and then umbrella tree. It's really just describing different things that grow in the mountains of Appalachia, especially southern Appalachia. So the umbrella leaf was a wild plant having large, broad leaves. 1937, Thornborough, Great Smoky Mountains. Less conspicuous are the umbrella leaf, of which there is but one other known species, and that found in Japan. That's interesting. Then the umbrella plant says it's the same as a mayapple. If you've ever seen a mayapple, you'll really recognize and see why it would be called that, because of it looks like a little umbrella, especially if you see a bunch of them all together. It kind of looks more like umbrellas that you'd put in a drink, though, because they're not very tall. I don't have any right here at my house, but on up the creek there's a lot. But I have never heard them called umbrella plant, only mayapple. And then the umbrella tree was a type of magnolia. Interesting. 1913, Morley, Carolina Mountains. There are several varieties of these cucumber and umbrella trees, as the people call them. The next one is just an unusual pronunciation, and I've never heard it. For women, it's umarin, with a U at the beginning. I've never heard that one. And then the next one, there's a lot of these, and as you might guess, the entries for the letter U are not as large as some of the other letters, the alphabet, just because there's not as many words. And one common one, though, that's repeated over and over in the dictionary is that instead of IN, like impatient, inconvenient, that's changed to a UN, like unpatient, inconvenient. And I do hear those, especially those two, fairly often. So it's just noting that that's changed, that you'll often hear that. Unbeknowing or unbeknowing of, adjective phrase, unknown, without knowing. 1867, Harris, Lovingood. Well, one day, about sundown, they crawled up unbeknowing to everybody, entered the roof, and Clare to the t'other and furthest from the lodge room and trapdoor, and lay powerful low, waiting for night and the masons. So it sounds like they were sneaking up there and unbeknowing to anybody, and it actually, instead of it's own be knowing. It's again just changing that very first part. Sounds like they were going to waylay somebody there. The next one is kind of still on that same line, unbeknown, but unbeknownst, they put the T on it. That's another common thing you'll hear often in the mountains of Appalachia, is that some people will add a T, once, across, those kind of, there's a whole lot of them, but those come to mind immediately. But that's very common that you'll hear those. I hear that sometimes from people that don't really sound like I do. They sound different, except sometimes I'll hear that T and I'll think, well, you've been around somebody that come from the same place I do. or at least a place similar where you heard that T, it was carried down. Another one just talking about the usage at the beginning is uncertain. You'll hear uncertain, uncertain. I've not heard that one. This next one is unchurched. Now, I'm not familiar with this because I would just hear church. If a church churches you, that means you've done something wrong and they're going to ask you to leave or ask you to come before the church. Maybe they'll vote on it and see if you can stay there. But unchurched, verb, to expel from church membership, same as church. That's the one that I'm more familiar with. 1966, from strangers, the worst fate that could befall a man was to be unchurched. He might accept it philosophically as a license to live his own life, but to his neighbors, for one to be churched, it meant that he could not possibly be saved. 1987, where, Sevierville, many were unchurched for going against the rules, especially for drinking and making whiskey. So today in Appalachia, in the part where I live, I don't know anyone that's been churched. That's something that's fell out of fashion, and probably maybe people begin to realize and understand that if you are a believer, you believe God forgives you. He's a forgiving God. So maybe that's why. But it does remind me of a really funny story I wrote about on the Blind Pig and the Acorn one time. I can't even remember where I come across it. Maybe at the John C. Campbell Folk School Archives. That might be where I found it. But it was somebody telling this story about that way back there. I mean, way back. They lived in Graham County in Robbinsville, so that's the next county over from me. Cherokee and then Graham. Well, Clay and Cherokee bump up against each other too, but Graham County. And two men had to go over to Knoxville. I think they were taking, if I remember right, maybe taking some, it was probably this time of the year or something, they were taking garden produce over there to sell. And they went over there and you know, in their wagons and sold what they needed to. Well, when they come back, they told this amazing story how that the people in Knoxville had ice. They had ice, and it was, you know, summer. It's hot weather. Well, the church churched them for lying. They wanted them to admit that they were lying, and they said they wasn't lying. It was the truth. They had ice in Knoxville. I think it was Knoxville now that I'm telling it. I'll have to link to it below so you can go read it. Anyway, but it was really comical because you think, well, how did they not believe them? But then at that time, when people in that area obviously had not seen ice, and then you think about them hearing a big tall tale about it. Well, it's July outside or August or whatever. They couldn't have ice. Of course, if you research that, you know that they could. Ice can be kept, and it was like the first refrigeration methods that we had available to us, and it can be kept for a long time in a certain situation, you know. Anyway, I always remember that when I think about church or unchurched in this case. Uncivil, again, that's just showing that sometimes you might hear on civil instead of uncivil. On civil. I've not heard that, on civil. I don't mean to be nowise on civil, but that there cabin were built by my grandfather and his least boy nigh on to 100 years ago, and ain't never had nary drap of paint on it, and I reckon it'll stand another 100 without no paint. So he was bragging on his cabin. Sounds like it was a good one. I really like this next one, and I don't hear this at all today, but Pat, my father, he certainly, when he would talk about people from the old days when he was a boy, he would call them, I mean, he used this when he would talk about them. He would call them uncle, even though I knew they wasn't really his uncle, just somebody in the community. Uncle, noun, a term of respect or affection, often prefaced with old, used to address or refer to an older man in the community, often with a man's full name, whether or not he is related to the speaker. Let's see, how far do we want to go? 1957, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I used to prowl these mountains all over, me and old Uncle F. Reagan. That's my brother-in-law. We would always go out in fall of the year. We made our crops. 1962, Williams, Mountaineers Mind Manners. Children addressed by first names, contemporaries of their parents, but they address people belonging to the generation of their grandparents as aunt and uncle without regard for blood kinship. So that's what I was trying to explain about Pap. That's how he would have done it. He didn't in present day, but when he looked back, that was like those terms he still remembered to use, aunt or uncle, for people that was just in his community that it were his elders, but not necessarily really his aunt or uncle. 1973, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I was taught to respect elderly people, and we were to refer to them as Aunt or Uncle One if they were old. 1985, Ware, Lost Communities. He was not my real uncle, but for respect, we children were taught to call all old people uncle and aunt. It's kind of a nice tradition. It's totally fallen out of fashion, though. Here's some more of those where they're just changing the beginning. So inconvenience, unconvenience. Understand, just changing those first two letters to O-N. Understand, understand. I've never heard that usage. I'll be really interested to see if you've heard it. Unfitting, unfit, unqualified. That one still, you'll still hear that. Maybe somebody's acting unfitting, or that's unfitting to eat or drink, or even something that maybe is old and wore out. It's unfitting now to use. It just don't work no more. Unionalls, a variant form, union halls, overalls. 1940, Hahn, Hawks Dunn, he had on new unionalls and they suited him. And then in 1968, it was documented here in Brasstown. I didn't really grow up with union halls, though, or hearing anybody say that. And then long underwear. Montgomery collection, even girls wore unionalls in the winter, which consisted of cotton knit with long sleeves and long legs with a trap door in the back, and that was Norris. We would just call those long handles or long johns. That's what we would call them. Unlesson, except. See also lesson, so it could be unlesson or lesson. I still hear that one sometimes. Untelling as an adjective, variant form, on-telling. I've never heard the on-telling. Untellable, indescribable, unbelievable. 1979, Carpenter, Walton War. What I have seen in my time is untelling. 1994, Walker Life History. It's untelling how many men and women I buried or built houses for. And then 1995, Montgomery Collection tells it was who it was known by, Adams and Brown. So that's one I still hear fairly often. You might hear somebody say, I went to the ball game and there's untelling how many people was there. It was packed. So that one's still fairly common. Here's some more just interesting about the adding that UN. Unthoughted, unthoughtedly, unthoughtless, unthoughty. Here's one, up, UP. To extend or intensify the action of verbs, see grammar. So it's telling us to look somewhere else, but we're going to just read these. 1925, Dargan, Highland Annals. When we find where he is, y'all stretch round above us, and I'll go in and sick up the dogs. So he was going to sick up the dogs. 1939, Hall Collection. They've got the town renewed up. She's improved up a bit. And then Smokemont, North Carolina. He went back into the laurel hung with his trap, and finally we traced him up. Those are all very common. I guarantee I can feed this hoss up about a week, curry him good, and so forth. He come down by here and he eat dinner at Mother's. See if you think about that one. He come up down by here. That don't even make sense, but those are all really common. Even now, here in the area of Appalachia where I live. Up against it, if you're up against it, you know, you're in a bad situation. Adjective phrase, confronted with economic difficulty, facing hard times or destitution. 1937 Hall Collection, Cades Cove. I used to plow with oxen when I was up against it. I had 2 yokes of oxen. That was Dave Sparks. 1982, Gins, Snowbird Gravy. Well, a fellow who was out there stealing in the daytime, he ain't really a stealing. He maybe was just up against it in the olden time. So up against it. That's not one that I hear very often, but that's one that I like. It kind of really does describe when you're having hard times, you're up against it. It's like almost like you're up against a big wall and you can't push it out of your way, can't get around it. Another one for up and. A variant past tense form, upped and. 1941, Justice, Kettle Creek. You needn't get miffed, Matt said, because I upped and asked you a point-blank question. 1945, hon, hawk's done. I got to thinking maybe she didn't know it, so I upped and told her that night when she said long boy was needing something, had been fretful for 2 days and don'tsy about his eating. I still hear that one some, so I might say, how would I use that? Well, I know we was going to wait, but I upped and told him because I couldn't stand it no more. I wanted him to know exactly what was going on because I need some help. So that one's fairly still common. Here's another usage for up. Now this is one that I tease Matt about. I never heard really anybody say it until I met him many years ago, of course now. Up in above, up in here, up in under. Preposition phrase. 1938, Bowman, High Horizons. It were showed me like a picture that the babe was asleep up and under a log like on the side of a ridge that I knowed where it by his size and shape. 1982, Powers and Hannah, Cataloochee. And sure enough, there come one right up in above where he lived over there on Cataloochee. 1997, Montgomery Collection. The old tomcat went up and under the chair. So that's, Matt would say that if something fell in the kitchen, he would say it's up and under the table. You just can't see it. Bend over and you'll see it, like if I was looking for something. So I used to tease him and say, how can it be up in under? It doesn't make sense. But he still says it all these years later, up and under. Up on my honor, up on my word. That's an interjection. Honestly, this is the truth, on my word. And sometimes you might hear that one just shortened to upon my word. Pawn my honor, just the pawn, kind of leaving off the U. Garber Mountainese, honestly, pawn my honor, there it is. I don't know a thing about this. 1993, Ison and Ison, whole nother. Pawn my honor, this is correct. I give you my word on this. 1997, Montgomery Collection, upon my honor, was known to Brewer, Bush, Cardwell, Jones, and Letford. Upon my word, Bush, Cardwell, Jones, and Weaver. So that I don't hear that one very much anymore unless somebody's doing it in a teasing way, you know, kind of to highlight their accent or something like that. But I like that one. Upscuttle. I didn't know this word. I didn't grow up with it, but I learned it years ago when I was writing for the Blind Pig and the Acorn, and I made one of the girls or one of us or somebody say it like in one of my little videos. And ever since then we use it, so I guess that's one that we've brought back into fashion, at least into our house, probably not anywhere else. But upscuttle is a noun, a coral. Even that, a coral, like Granny and Pat, when we were growing up, if me and Paul was fussing, they'd say, quit quarreling, quit quarreling. Today most people would just say fighting, quit fighting. 1913, Cape Art, our Southern Highlanders. If they quarrel, it is a ruction, a rippet, a jower, or an upscuttle. 1941, Justice doubled up his fist and swung out his arms. There'd be an upscuttle, all right. So he was getting ready. He was getting ready for his upscuttle. Used to. See also usen, would used to. Adverb phrase, formerly, placed before the subject in clauses having a past tense or present perfect verb. 1931, Goodrich, Mountain Homespun. Used to, when we was little, we'd make us horses out of corn stalks. 1972, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Well, they don't house them anymore. Used to, they did. 1973, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. That branch that comes off that yuns lives in the Holy Butt branch. Used to. I've been up squirrel hunting. Used to. I've been up in there lots of times back my younger days a-hunting. 1975, Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Used to, why, we'd be snowed in for 2 or 3 weeks at a time in these mountains. 1978, Montgomery, White Pine Collection. Used to, you know, there wasn't very much working on Sundays. Used to, we had the panthers and wildcats to keep the balance, but they're just about extinct, you know. Used to, once in a while, they'd have some kind of frolic up at White Pine. 1991, Williams, home place. People used to, they didn't count rich in money then, they count rich in land and property. 2001, Montgomery file. Used to, when she came through town, we would always have dinner. That was a 60-year-old man in Tennessee. And then that one goes on to the B part of that, is in phrases used to could, used to couldn't, formerly was able to, was not able to. 1973, Used to couldn't was in Sevier County, Tennessee. 1984, Gibson remembering, you used to could look from Grandpa's door to the graveyard in the church house where we attended church. And then in phrases, used to didn't, formerly did not. 1978, Montgomery White Pine, we used to didn't have nearly so many houses. 1991, King News Sentinel South, people used to didn't have much to do, so they'd entertain each other by sitting around the fire at night. And in 2001, it came out like it used to did. So all of those, of course, if you hear me read them, you may be like, well, that's just terrible grammar is what that is. Maybe it is, but those are all still common in the area where I live. Used to, and in fact, especially the first one, the used to, like used to when we was little, we'd make horses out of corn stalks. Used to. How else would you say that? Used to. I'm sure there's a way. I say that sometimes, and then people say, well, Tipper, you'd say this, and then I read it, and I'm like, oh, yeah, that's what you'd say. But all of those are very common in my area of Appalachia even today. And I guess someday I'm going to be, there used to be that lady that was plumb foolish about the language and the way people talked and the accent of Appalachia. Do you remember her? I guess that'll be who I used to be. Maybe somebody will remember me for that one day. I hope you enjoyed this part of the dictionary today, going over the words and phrases that start with the letter U. If you were familiar with them, please leave a comment and tell us what you know about them, or tell us if you've never heard of them. Either way, I always love to hear from you to see what you know about the words and phrases, and if they're still alive and well where you're at, because that's the thing with the words and phrases like this used in the mountains of Appalachia. It's very varied. Like this is focusing on the southern part of Appalachia. So you think of further north, of course it's different, but sometimes it's even different from my holler here in Wilson Holler to the next holler over, maybe over the ridge in Pinhook. There'll even be a difference. So that's one of the fascinating things about it. And I'm forever grateful to Michael Montgomery for taking on this project and compiling all these words and then starting the second edition, and also thankful for Jennifer that helped him even after he had passed away. Michael did. She made sure that all his work come to fruition. I'll always be thankful for both of them.